Most people believe they have a firm grasp on the concept of inflation. You hear about it constantly on the news. You feel its impact every time you visit the grocery store. And every few years, a new politician emerges promising to fix it. However, there is an uncomfortable truth that almost nobody is willing to discuss. The way we define inflation in the modern era, the way it is taught in prestigious universities, printed in academic textbooks, and repeated by central bankers during press conferences, is not at all how inflation was understood for the vast majority of human history. This fundamental shift in definition was not a random accident. It was a deliberate and calculated reframing, one that serves the interests of the people who create money while quietly penalizing the people who have to earn it through labor. If you were to ask the average economist today for a definition of inflation, they would tell you it is a general rise in the prices of goods and services. It sounds simple enough. But for the vast majority of economic history, stretching from the Roman Empire through the American Civil War and well into the 20th century, the term inflation meant something entirely different. It referred specifically to an increase in the total money supply. In this traditional view, rising prices were not inflation itself. They were merely a consequence of inflation, a visible symptom of an underlying cause. Think about that distinction for a moment because it changes everything about how we assign blame. If inflation is defined simply as prices going up, then the blame can be conveniently shifted onto greedy corporations, supply chain disruptions, oil shocks, bad weather, or any number of external factors. But if inflation is understood as an expansion of the money supply, then the blame falls squarely and exclusively on one entity, the institution that controls the printing press. As you might imagine, this is exactly why the definition was changed. The economist Henry Hazlitt put it plainly when he said that inflation is an increase in the quantity of money and credit, and that its chief consequence is soaring prices. Ludwig von Mises, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, went even further, arguing that inflation is not a natural phenomenon, but a deliberate policy choice made by governments and central banks. Yet if you open any mainstream economics textbook published after roughly 1960, you will find inflation defined purely as a rise in the consumer price index. The cause has been systematically erased from the definition. What remains is only the effect, stripped of its historical context and stripped of any real accountability. Today, we are going to trace the real history of inflation from the very first time a civilization debased its currency to the modern age of quantitative easing. Along the way, we are going to examine what historians and economists consistently get wrong, who benefits from those errors, and what it actually means for your money, your savings, and your future. Let us start where most serious histories of money begin, not with modern central banking, but with the Roman Empire. Rome provides one of the earliest and most dramatic case studies of what happens when a government systematically destroys the value of its own currency. When historians write about the fall of Rome, they tend to focus on military overstretch, barbarian invasions, political corruption, and cultural decay. All of those factors certainly played a role, but what often gets buried in the footnotes is the monetary dimension. This was a centuries-long process by which Roman emperors gradually drained the precious metal content from their coins and replaced it with base metals, a process known as debasement. In the early days of the empire under Augustus, the Roman denarius was a coin of near pure silver. It was trusted across the known world. Roman currency was accepted from Britain to Mesopotamia, not because of Rome's military might alone, but because the coins themselves contained real, tangible value. A Roman merchant in Egypt or a trader along the Silk Road knew that the silver in a denarius was worth something intrinsic, regardless of which emperor's face was stamped on it. But wars are expensive, and civil conflicts are even more expensive, and the Roman Empire seemed to have an endless appetite for both. By the middle of the 3rd century, the empire was engulfed in what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century. This was a period of relentless foreign invasions by Persians and Germanic tribes, devastating civil wars, plagues, food shortages, and a revolving door of emperors who seized power and were assassinated in rapid succession. Political stability was a distant memory, and each new emperor who clawed his way to the throne needed one thing above all else: money to pay the legions whose loyalty kept him alive. The solution was debasement. Rather than raise taxes, which risked revolt, or cut military spending, which risked being overthrown, emperors simply reduced the silver content in their coins. Under Augustus, the denarius contained roughly 95% silver. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, it had dropped to around 75%. By the 260s, the denarius was essentially a bronze coin with a thin silver wash containing less than 5% actual silver. The ratio between gold coins and the debased denarius exploded from 25 to 1 in the days of Augustus to over 1,000 to 1 by the 260s. The consequences were devastating and entirely predictable. As the real value of the coins collapsed, prices soared. Soldiers demanded higher pay, merchants raised their prices, and farmers refused to sell grain for worthless currency. Confidence in money itself evaporated. This was not some abstract economic phenomenon debated in scholarly journals. It was a lived catastrophe that affected tens of millions of people across 3 continents. Contemporary observers describe prices escalating not gradually, but violently and suddenly. When Emperor Diocletian came to power toward the end of the 3rd century, he inherited this economic disaster and tried to address it with brute force. In 301, he issued his famous Edict on Maximum Prices, a sweeping piece of legislation that set legal ceilings on the prices of roughly 100 goods and services across the entire empire. In the preamble to this edict, Diocletian himself described what we would recognize today as runaway inflation, speaking of prices that did not climb by years or by months, but by hours. The edict prescribed the death penalty for anyone caught charging more than the maximum allowed price. Merchants who hoarded goods or refused to sell were compared to barbarian invaders and treated with equal severity. And yet, the edict failed spectacularly. Merchants simply withdrew their goods from public markets, and a thriving black market emerged almost overnight. Enforcement proved impossible across the vast territory of the empire. The rhetorician Lactantius, who lived through this period, openly blamed the emperors themselves for the inflation and described the fighting and bloodshed that erupted from the price controls. Within a few years, the edict was quietly abandoned. Now, here is where historians tend to get the story wrong, or at least incomplete. The standard narrative treats Roman inflation as a unique product of political chaos in military crisis. But the mechanism, the debasement of currency to fund government spending, is not unique at all. It is a pattern that has repeated itself across civilizations, across centuries, and across every form of government ever devised. What Diocletian failed to understand, and what many modern policymakers still refuse to acknowledge, is that you cannot legislate away the consequences of monetary expansion. Price controls do not address the cause of inflation. They only suppress its most visible symptom, and in doing so, they create new distortions that are often worse than the original problem. It was not until Emperor Constantine introduced the solidus, a new gold coin of high purity struck at 72 to a pound of gold, that the Roman monetary system found any real stability. The solidus would remain a trusted store of value for centuries. But by then, the damage had been done. The Roman economy had been fundamentally restructured. Gold became the currency of the elite, while the common people were stuck with debased bronze coins whose value fluctuated wildly. A 2-tier economy had been created, one for the powerful and one for everyone else. If that sounds familiar, it should. Let us jump forward about 200 years to the second great inflationary episode that historians tend to mischaracterize, the price revolution of the 16th century. Between roughly 1520 and 1650, prices across Western Europe rose dramatically. In some regions, the cost of basic goods increased 6-fold over the span of about 150 years. By modern standards, an annual inflation rate of 1 to 2% might seem negligible, but in the context of the 16th century, where economies depended on the stable value of silver and gold coins, it was catastrophic. Wages could not keep pace. Landowners and creditors were enriched, while laborers and debtors were crushed. Social unrest followed predictably. The conventional explanation for this, the one you will find in most history textbooks, is straightforward. Spain conquered vast territories in the Americas and extracted enormous quantities of gold and silver. Between 1503 and 1650, Spain imported approximately 6 million kilograms of silver and roughly 185,000 kilograms of gold from its colonial mines. This flood of precious metal increased the money supply across Europe and drove prices upward. It is the textbook example of what Milton Friedman would later describe as inflation, being always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. The textbook version is not entirely wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. What most historians overlook is that the inflationary pressures in Spain actually began before the peak of silver imports. Prices were already climbing in the late 1500s, even as the full deluge of American silver had not yet arrived. A team of researchers using isotopic analysis of Spanish coins found evidence that for more than a century the Spanish did not use imported silver to mint coins at all, suggesting that the amount of currency in circulation may not have increased as dramatically as the traditional narrative assumes. If that is true, then other factors, population growth, urbanization, agricultural disruption, and the depopulation of southern Spain, may have played a much larger role than the silver hypothesis accounts for. But there is an even more important dimension to the story, one that connects directly to the modern debate about inflation. In 1556, a Spanish cleric named Martín de Azpilcueta, a member of the school of Salamanca, observed something remarkably prescient. He noted that in times when money was scarcer, goods and labor were given for much less than after the discovery of the Indies, which had flooded the country with gold and silver. This was, in essence, the earliest articulation of the quantity theory of money, the idea that an increase in the money supply leads to a proportional increase in prices. What is astonishing is that Azpilcueta made this observation 12 years before Jean Bodin, the French philosopher who is usually credited with first connecting the influx of precious metals to rising prices. The historian Earl Hamilton, who spent decades researching Spanish price data, was astounded to discover that no other Spanish writer of the 16th century had voiced similar opinions. The Salamanca school's insight was effectively buried for centuries, rediscovered only in the 20th century by the scholar Marjorie Grice Hutchinson. This brings us to a recurring pattern in the history of inflation. The people who understand what is really happening are often ignored, marginalized, or simply forgotten, while the official narrative is shaped by those who benefit from public confusion. The Spanish monarchy had every incentive to downplay the relationship between its colonial silver and rising prices. Acknowledging the connection would have meant acknowledging that the crown's greatest source of wealth was simultaneously impoverishing its own citizens. This pattern would repeat itself with devastating consequences in the 20th century. Consider the Weimar Republic, the most extreme case of hyperinflation in modern Western history, and one that is almost universally misunderstood. The standard story goes something like this. Germany lost the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparation payments. The government could not afford to pay, so it printed money and prices spiraled out of control. By November 1923, the exchange rate reached 4.2 trillion marks to a single United States dollar. Children played with bricks of worthless banknotes, and people wallpapered their homes with currency because it was cheaper than actual wallpaper. All of that is true, but the story as commonly told makes it sound like hyperinflation was an inevitable consequence of the reparations, a kind of natural disaster that befell a helpless nation. The reality is far more complicated and far more instructive. Germany's inflation did not begin with the reparations. It began during the war itself. The German government financed its war effort almost entirely through borrowing rather than taxation. By 1918, the national debt had ballooned to 156 billion marks. When the war ended and the bills came due, the government faced a choice. It could impose severe austerity, raise taxes dramatically, and endure the political consequences, or it could print money and hope for the best. It chose the printing press. The decision to finance passive resistance against the Franco-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr in 1923 dramatically accelerated the crisis. Wages and subsidies were paid to workers who were on strike and producing nothing. These expenditures were funded entirely through monetary expansion. The government was creating money to pay people for not working, and the inevitable result was a catastrophic collapse in the currency's value. Only 15% of total government expenditure was covered by tax revenue. The rest was simply printed. But here is what most accounts leave out. The hyperinflation was not just an economic disaster. It was a wealth transfer mechanism of staggering proportions. While ordinary Germans, pensioners, salaried workers, and people with savings accounts watched their life savings evaporate in a matter of months, a select group of insiders profited enormously. Industrialists who held tangible assets like factories, land, and machinery saw the real value of their debts wiped out by the inflation. Speculators like Hugo Stinnes made fortunes by borrowing heavily in marks, buying real assets, and then repaying their loans in worthless currency. Debtors were liberated while creditors were destroyed. The middle class, which had been the backbone of German society, was hollowed out. This is the mechanism that an 18th century economist named Richard Cantillon identified nearly 3 centuries ago, and which modern economists still largely ignore. The Cantillon effect, as it has come to be known, describes a simple but profound truth about money creation. When new money enters an economy, it does not arrive in everyone's bank account simultaneously. It flows first to specific institutions and individuals, usually banks, governments, and large corporations. These first recipients get to spend the new money before prices have adjusted upward. They buy assets, invest in markets, and deploy capital at the old price level. By the time the new money filters down to workers, savers, and consumers at the bottom of the economic food chain, prices have already risen, and the purchasing power of each unit of currency has already been diluted. In other words, inflation is not a neutral event that affects everyone equally. It is a redistribution mechanism, and it consistently redistributes wealth upward from those who earn money through labor to those who are closest to the source of money creation. Cantillon articulated this insight in his masterwork, published posthumously in 1755, roughly 4 decades before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Murray Rothbard, the libertarian economist, argued that Cantillon, not Smith, deserves the title of father of modern economics. And yet Cantillon remains virtually unknown outside of specialist circles. His most important idea, that the path through which new money flows through an economy determines who wins and who loses, is almost never discussed in mainstream economics courses. This is not an oversight. It is a structural feature of how economics has been taught for the past century. If the Cantillon effect were widely understood, people would begin asking very uncomfortable questions about who really benefits from monetary expansion, and the answers would implicate the very institutions that fund universities, sponsor research, and employ economists. Now let us move to the event that transformed the global monetary system more than any other in the 20th century and set the stage for the inflationary regime we live under today. On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced a series of economic measures that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between money and value. The most consequential of these measures was the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. Foreign governments could no longer present their dollars to the Federal Reserve and receive gold in return at $35 per ounce. The gold window was closed. Nixon framed this as a temporary measure, a response to what he called international money speculators who were threatening the stability of the dollar. In reality, it was the culmination of decades of fiscal overreach. The United States had been spending far beyond its means, financing the Vietnam War, the Great Society welfare programs, and the Cold War arms race. Simultaneously, foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, had noticed that America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them, and they had begun demanding gold in exchange for their dollar holdings. The U.S. gold reserves were hemorrhaging. Something had to give. What gave was the last tether connecting paper money to physical reality. The Bretton Woods system established in 1944 had made the U.S. dollar the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at a fixed rate. Every other major currency was pegged to the dollar, and, through it, to gold. This system imposed discipline on governments. If a country printed too much money, it would face a balance of payments crisis as gold flowed out to nations with more responsible monetary policies. The system was imperfect, but it functioned as a constraint on the worst impulses of central banks and politicians. When Nixon severed that constraint, he did not just change American monetary policy, he transformed the entire global financial system. Within 2 years, the Bretton Woods system collapsed entirely, replaced by the floating exchange rate regime that governs currency markets to this day. For the first time in human history, every major economy on Earth was operating on pure fiat currency, money backed by nothing except the promise of governments and the faith of the people who use it. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. The price of gold, which had been artificially held at $35 per ounce for decades, began its long ascent. By 1980, it had reached over $800. The United States experienced its worst peacetime inflation in history during the 1970s, with annual rates reaching nearly 15% by 1980. The entire decade was defined by a phenomenon that mainstream economists had insisted was impossible: stagflation, the simultaneous occurrence of high inflation and high unemployment. This was supposed to be impossible because of the Phillips curve, a theoretical framework that posited a stable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. The idea was simple and seductive. If you wanted lower unemployment, you could accept a little more inflation. If you wanted lower inflation, you could tolerate a little more unemployment. Policymakers could simply choose their preferred point on the curve. Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps had warned in the late 1960s that this trade-off was illusory, that any attempt to exploit it would lead to accelerating inflation without lasting employment gains. They were proven dramatically right. The 1970s shattered the Phillips curve framework and forced a painful rethinking of monetary policy. But the lesson that should have been learned, that governments cannot spend and print their way to prosperity without consequence, has been repeatedly forgotten and relearned at enormous cost. This is where we arrive at perhaps the most important misconception that historians and economists perpetuate about inflation. The idea that inflation is a technical problem, a malfunction in the economic machinery that can be fine-tuned away by sufficiently clever central bankers. This framing is not just wrong, it is designed to obscure something fundamental about the nature of inflation. Inflation is not a bug in the system, it is a feature. It is the mechanism through which governments finance spending they cannot pay for through taxation. It is the mechanism through which debts are quietly eroded without the political cost of default. And it is the mechanism through which wealth is transferred from savers to borrowers, from the bottom of the economic hierarchy to the top. Consider the redefinition itself. For most of economic history, as we discussed earlier, inflation referred to an expansion of the money supply. The word comes from the Latin inflare, meaning to blow into or to inflate. In the 19th century, when Americans spoke of inflation, they almost always meant the inflation of paper currency. Rising prices were understood to be the consequence, not the thing itself. The modern definition, a general rise in prices as measured by the Consumer Price Index, did not become dominant until the 1960s. This was not a natural evolution of language. It was a deliberate reframing that served specific institutional interests. If inflation is defined as rising prices, then it can be blamed on countless factors: supply shocks, demand surges, corporate greed, labor costs, energy markets. The finger can be pointed in 1,000 directions. But if inflation is defined as an expansion of the money supply, then there is only one institution to blame: the central bank that controls the supply of money. The Consumer Price Index itself was never designed to capture the full picture of inflation's effects. It measures changes in the prices of a basket of consumer goods and services, but it does not account for asset price inflation, the dramatic increases in the prices of stocks, bonds, real estate, and other financial assets that are often the first and most dramatic consequence of monetary expansion. When the Federal Reserve creates trillions of dollars through quantitative easing, that money does not flow immediately into grocery stores and gas stations. It flows first into financial markets. Stock prices surge, real estate values climb, and the wealth of asset owners, who tend to be already wealthy, increases dramatically. Meanwhile, wages stagnate, and the cost of housing becomes increasingly unaffordable for young families and first-time buyers. This is the Cantillon effect operating in real time, 3 centuries after Cantillon first described it. Because the Consumer Price Index does not capture asset price inflation, policymakers can point to official statistics and claim that inflation is contained, even as the lived experience of ordinary people tells a very different story. When people say that inflation feels higher than what the official numbers report, they are not delusional. They are perceiving a real phenomenon that the metrics are designed not to measure. The economist Claudio Borio argued in a 2012 paper that the economics profession had forgotten the lessons of the past and had neglected the financial drivers of business cycles, particularly the roles of credit creation and asset prices. The way the Consumer Price Index is calculated has changed dramatically over the decades, with methodological revisions in the 1970s and again in the 1990s, introducing what is called substitution logic, allowing the index to reflect consumers switching to cheaper alternatives as prices rise. The result is an index that may not fully capture the cost of maintaining a consistent standard of living over time. This is how the game works. The definition of inflation has changed so that the public focuses on consumer prices rather than money supply growth. The measurement of consumer prices is then adjusted using substitution logic so that the reported number is lower than what people actually experience. With inflation appearing contained in official statistics, policymakers face little public resistance when they expand the money supply to fund politically popular programs. The first recipients of new money, financial institutions and asset holders, benefit enormously. The last recipients, wage earners and savers, absorb the cost through higher prices and diminished purchasing power. This brings us to the present moment and to the most dangerous misconception of all, the idea that we have somehow solved the inflation problem. The Great Moderation, the period from the mid-1980s to around 2007, was characterized by relatively stable consumer prices and strong economic growth. Central bankers congratulated themselves. The Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan and later Ben Bernanke was credited with having tamed inflation through skillful management of interest rates. The prevailing consensus was that we had entered a new era where inflation was a problem of the past, something that happened in banana republics and failed states, not in advanced economies with independent central banks. But what was actually happening during the Great Moderation was not the absence of inflation, it was the redirection of inflation. Consumer prices remained stable in part because of the integration of China and other low-cost manufacturing economies into global supply chains. The prices of manufactured goods, clothing, electronics, and household items actually fell in real terms. But asset prices, housing, equities, and financial instruments of every description were inflating at extraordinary rates. The money was being created. It was flowing into the economy. It was just flowing into assets rather than consumer goods. Because the metrics were designed to measure consumer prices, not asset prices, the official statistics said everything was fine. Then came 2008, and the illusion shattered. The global financial crisis revealed that what had appeared to be stable prosperity was, in fact, a massive debt-fueled bubble inflated by years of loose monetary policy and credit expansion. The response to the crisis was predictably more of the same. Central banks around the world unleashed unprecedented waves of money creation through quantitative easing programs. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from roughly $900 billion before the crisis to over $4.5 trillion by 2015. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England followed suit. Then came 2020, and the response to the pandemic made everything that came before look modest by comparison. In the United States alone, the government authorized roughly $5 trillion in stimulus spending, financed largely through monetary expansion. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet surged past $9 trillion. Trillions of dollars were created and injected into the economy through various channels: stimulus checks to individuals, loans to businesses, and purchases of government and corporate bonds. The result was entirely predictable to anyone who understood the history we have traced today. Consumer price inflation surged to levels not seen in 4 decades. By the middle of 2022, the annual inflation rate in the United States exceeded 9%. Grocery prices, energy costs, and housing expenses all rose sharply. The Federal Reserve, which had spent the better part of a year insisting that the inflation was transitory, was forced to reverse course and raise interest rates at the fastest pace in decades. But even this dramatic episode has been largely mischaracterized in the public discourse. The blame has been scattered across a dozen different explanations: supply chain disruptions, the war in Ukraine, corporate price gouging, labor shortages. All of these factors contributed to specific price increases in specific sectors, but the underlying cause, the fundamental reason why prices across the board rose simultaneously and persistently, was the massive expansion of the money supply. Too many dollars were chasing too few goods. This is not a controversial observation. It is the most basic principle of monetary economics. Yet acknowledging it openly would require acknowledging that the government's response to the pandemic, however well-intentioned, had predictable inflationary consequences that fell most heavily on the people least equipped to absorb them. So what do historians get wrong about inflation? Almost everything that matters. They treat it as a modern phenomenon when it has been destroying civilizations for millennia. They present it as a technical problem when it is fundamentally a political one. They define it as a rise in prices when it is actually an expansion of the money supply, a distinction that has been deliberately obscured. They focus on consumer prices while ignoring asset price inflation, which is where the most consequential wealth transfers occur. They celebrate the central bankers who claim to have tamed inflation while ignoring the massive asset bubbles those same bankers inflated. And they consistently fail to account for the distributional effects of money creation, the Cantillon effect, which ensures that the benefits of inflation flow to those closest to the money spigot, while the costs are borne by everyone else. The Roman emperors who debased their coins to pay their armies understood what they were doing. They may not have had the vocabulary of modern economics, but they understood the fundamental transaction. They were confiscating wealth from the general population through the debasement of the currency and redistributing it to the military establishment that kept them in power. Diocletian, when he issued his edict on maximum prices, was trying to treat the symptom because he could not or would not address the cause. The fact that his edict failed, that it created black markets and shortages, and was ultimately abandoned, is a lesson that has been repeated in every century since, from the French Revolution's assignats to Richard Nixon's wage and price controls in 1971. The Spanish monarchy that flooded Europe with New World silver understood, at least on some level, that it was enriching itself at the expense of its own citizens. The theologians of the school of Salamanca saw it clearly and said so, but their voices were drowned out by the noise of imperial ambition and colonial plunder. The architects of the Weimar Republic's hyperinflation understood that printing money to fund government operations without corresponding economic output would destroy the currency. They did it anyway because the alternative, political confrontation and economic restructuring, was more immediately painful. The people who paid the price were not the industrialists and speculators who profited from the chaos. They were the pensioners, the teachers, the shopkeepers, the ordinary citizens whose savings were annihilated. The central bankers of the 21st century understand, or should understand, that creating trillions of dollars of new money and injecting it into financial markets will inflate asset prices, widen inequality, and eventually bleed into consumer prices. They do it anyway because the short-term political benefits of stimulus outweigh the long-term economic costs, at least for the people making the decisions. The through line of this entire history is not complicated. It is, in fact, painfully simple. Inflation is not a mysterious force that descends upon economies without warning. It is a policy choice. It is the result of deliberate decisions made by governments and central banks to create more money than the economy can absorb. The consequences are predictable. They have been predicted accurately by economists from Azpilicueta in 1556 to Cantillon in 1730 to Friedman in 1963. And they are always the same. Prices rise, savings erode, and the gap between the wealthy and everyone else widens. The people who created the problem blame it on everyone except themselves. What makes this history so difficult to confront honestly is that inflation is not just an economic phenomenon. It is a deeply political one. Governments have used inflation as a hidden tax for centuries because it is far easier to debase a currency than to raise taxes openly. When a government prints money to fund its operations, it is effectively taxing every person who holds that currency by reducing its purchasing power. But unlike a traditional tax, which requires legislation, public debate, and democratic accountability, inflation happens silently, gradually, and without a vote. This is why the redefinition of inflation matters so much. By shifting the definition from money supply expansion to price increases, the architects of modern monetary policy have successfully obscured the causal chain that connects their decisions to your shrinking paycheck. The Consumer Price Index, with all its methodological adjustments and substitution effects, serves as a kind of camouflage, making the true rate of purchasing power loss appear smaller than it actually is. None of this is a conspiracy. It does not need to be. It is simply the predictable behavior of institutions acting in their own interest. Central banks exist in a political environment. Their leaders are appointed by politicians. Their mandates are defined by legislation. And the easiest way to fund government spending without the political friction of taxation or the economic pain of spending cuts is to expand the money supply and let inflation do the work quietly. The question is not whether this is happening. The historical record makes it undeniable. The question is what you choose to do with this knowledge. Understanding the true origin of inflation does not make you immune to its effects, but it does give you a framework for interpreting the economic events that shape your life. When you hear that inflation is caused by supply chains or corporate greed, you can ask the more fundamental question: what happened to the money supply? When you hear that the Consumer Price Index shows inflation is under control, you can look at asset prices and ask whether the metrics are capturing the full picture. And when you hear that monetary expansion is necessary to stimulate the economy, you can ask who receives the new money first and who pays the price later. The Romans debased their coins, the Spanish flooded their economy with colonial silver, the Weimar Republic ran the printing press until the currency was worth less than the paper it was printed on, and in the 21st century, the most sophisticated central banks in the world have created trillions of dollars, euros, yen, and pounds with the click of a button. The technology changes, the terminology evolves, and the institutional architecture grows more complex, but the fundamental dynamic remains identical to what it was 2,000 years ago. When you create more money without creating more real value, prices rise, savings erode, and the people closest to the source of new money benefit at the expense of everyone else. That is the true origin of inflation. It is not a mystery. It is not a technical malfunction. It is the oldest trick in the Book of Power. And the fact that so many historians still get it wrong is not an accident. It is the trick working exactly as intended. If this exploration of the hidden forces behind your shrinking purchasing power has changed how you view the economy, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We are dedicated to uncovering the historical truths that the establishment prefers to keep buried. Join us as we map out the financial landscape of the future. The next chapter of our investigation will be revealed soon.